What is history? History is women following behind with a bucket. That is certainly not going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. With the election a few days away, I'm finding it imperative now to bring about this incredible play that I have read a few times already. I believe it is a play that every American needs to read, considering it was written by one of the great British playwrights, Mr. Alan Bennett. The History Boys. I was hired as a full-time English teacher beginning in the fall of 2016. And around the time of the election, most of the people that I knew were in complete disbelief that Trump was even up for election. It was between him and Hillary Clinton. On election day, it also happened to be the graduation for the seniors at the school where I taught. I've never heard of such a thing. I've never known of anyone who would have graduation on election day. I don't know why. The atmosphere that was surrounding everybody that day was a conglomerate of fear, disbelief, shock, anger, worry, so much uncertainty. And I remember I drove down, I carpooled with a few of my colleagues down to the Ontario Convention Center where the graduation was taking place. Now, none of my students that I had were graduating that year, but I was there for the other seniors who were graduating. Our school is an optional school, and students can graduate either in the fall or the spring. When we got there, it just seemed like everyone's mindset was not focused on the grad students. Everyone was focused on the election. People had their phones out. People some of them even had portable radios just to see what the polls were. Everyone was just on pins and needles the entire time. I don't think anyone really enjoyed the graduation on that particular day. And then when we were driving back, it was the same thing. What is going on in this country? Why are the polls showing him ahead? What is going on? And it just went on and on and on into the night. And then I was so wiped out that I fell asleep, and I woke up the next day and Trump had the electoral vote. And I remember coming in, I think all the teachers that day were just, their heads were sort of hanging down, and I'm looking at my at the principal of the school. I told her, I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Because a lot of the students that I have are part of the DREAM Act. These are students of, and if I'm not mistaken, I think they were the students of illegal aliens that came in, but because they were part of this DREAM Act, they were protected. And with Trump in office, all that was going to change. And she says to me, no matter what happens, we need to be there for them. We are here for the students. It doesn't matter who is president. She says we have a job to do. As teachers, we are there to educate so that these students are the next decision makers. We have to be there for them. And we will do what we need to so that they stay in school no matter what. And so I was like, okay, all right. But again, that day when I was there at the school, it was just, even the students were in complete shock. And some of them were very much in fear of what could possibly happen to them. And I managed to get on with the rest of my day, but I was just not in the mood for doing anything. And at that point, I needed to pick me up. And there was one story, there was one film that I knew I could go to at any time to bring me up out of the dumps and remind me who I was and why I was there. I had seen the film before I read the play, and I read the play before I saw this YouTube video of someone recording the actual performance of Alan Bennett's The History Boys. And I needed to hear the words of Mrs. Dorothy Lintott. Get ready to write down some notes. Grab your quill, grab your paper, and get ready to write down with me. And the reason why I give this book a 4 out of 5 is because part of the script is in French, and if you don't understand French, you're certainly not going to understand what the scene was really about. I don't know if there is a critical edition of the play, but if there is, I would like to see the English translation of what was going on in that particular scene. It was with one of the teachers named Hector, who is the literature teacher. You have to understand that where the story takes place is in the 1980s in Yorkshire, England. And these 8 boys are specifically, they're in their very last, it's either their last year or their very last semester. And when new teachers are coming into the field, just like myself, I was a student teacher. I was actually under the guidance of a master teacher, and I was basically given the class. I was given mostly control, and if I had any questions or if I needed the drill sergeant, which was the master teacher, to step in, that's exactly what I did. In this play, Irwin comes in as a student teacher, and he's looking for a class so that he can teach history. And so there's already a history teacher there named Mrs. Dorothy Lintott, and the other teacher, of course, is Hector. The teachers were played by Stephen Campbell, who played the student teacher. Hector was played by the late Richard Griffiths. And then Frances de la Tour, being very, very tall. She has this really unique voice. She sounds very sort of nasal, but imagine having a nasal voice and yawning at the same time, but having that very stiff upper lip. On with the play. The first thing that I wanted to go over was the introduction. The idea is to teach the young to think and to argue. We shouldn't have to tell them what to think. That is their job. We give them a question, and if they don't understand the question, we can guide them to understand how we perceive to understand it, but we can't teach them to really argue. We can give them a couple of options to debate about, but we shouldn't tell them. We shouldn't have to tell them what to say. That is not our job as teachers. Then this is something that Alan Bennett wrote, which I think is quite interesting. Always beneath the play you write is the play you meant to write. Changed, but not abandoned. And with luck, not betrayed, but shadowing still the play that has yet to come. So I'm wondering, reading the play as it was published, what could have been different than the play that he already wrote? What could have been different from the History Boys? Could he have written, what if he was to write, maybe from a feminist point of view, what if he was to write a play called The History Girls? I just wanted to read this one from Mrs. Lintott. A nickname is an achievement, both in the sense of something won, and also it is Omeral's sense of a badge, a blazon. So if anyone has ever been given a nickname or a pet name, especially when you're given one by students, and that's kind of like giving you the okay, you're a good teacher, we trust you. And if the teacher's totally okay with it, then that's totally fine. Before I go on quoting from the play itself, I did want to mention that basically what's happening is these 8 boys are in their final year or their final semester, and they're getting ready to apply to 3 of the great colleges in England. There's Oxford and Cambridge and King's College. So, but the boys are really good at history, which is why they have aced the history class. But the headmaster really wants them to apply themselves. And the thing that I've come to learn is that there's like an underlying true meaning of why they want this, because they want their school to be known as being the best because our students are educated well here. It's sort of like they want to, the more that their students are able to apply and get into these top colleges, that means the school is going to gain a reputation. Sometimes a lot of schools push students to do beyond their best, and sometimes it's not always in the student's interest. And that's the same thing with colleges too. But to get into the Ivy League colleges is literally almost impossible. You have to, especially when it comes to American students, I can't speak for students in the UK or elsewhere, but in America, there's this final test called the SAT. And the higher your SAT score is, those colleges that you apply to are the ones that are going to reach out to you, sometimes maybe even more than the ones that you decided upon. They're saying that your scores are so great, we want you. There's a reason for that, because they want the best of the best to represent their college. But the students at this particular school in Yorkshire are now being pushed to the limits, especially when it comes to their history class. And that's sort of, it's all focused somewhat on history, but it's also focusing on the other teacher, Hector, who is their literature teacher. He's a very complex character. He loves the boys. He's teaching them. He is a literature professor. He's testing the boys about poetry. He tests them on compound adjectives. But even more than that, he really wants his boys to be able to think for themselves, to be free of being pushed, to not be confined and restricted to what the headmaster wants. It seems like a lot of the characters in the play do not like this headmaster at all, but he's the head of the school, and what he says goes. One of the things that the boys and Hector do in his literature class is he kind of gives his boys their freedom, and they kind of like to test him as well. So sometimes the students will perform a little skit from a film like Now Voyager, for instance, or from something else. And how much do they know versus what the professor knows? And the professor is always quoting from a poet or from a film. And so the boys had never heard of Now Voyager. And he reminds them, he says, Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. And that made me think, a lot of films, a lot of stories have been based on poetry of the past, even the most from Shakespeare's plays. So Now Voyager is from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. What Dreams May Come, that is from Hamlet's soliloquy. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. The Tempest by Shakespeare. To Thine Own Self Be True. If you are fans of Reba McEntire, her song Fancy, there's a lyric in there that includes To Thine Own Self Be True, and that is from the character of Polonius in Hamlet. He is the chief minister to King Claudius, and Polonius's daughter is Ophelia, and she is still a young woman coming into womanhood, and he thinks that she's still this young thing who doesn't know the real ways of the world and how it's run by men. But he also has a son named Laertes, and before Laertes goes off for his studies, he's advising him on what it means to be a human being. He's sort of like an orator. He's very much the wise old man, but sticking his nose in places where he shouldn't be. Another one that was mentioned is Neither Borrower Nor Lender Be. That's also mentioned in the film Victor Victoria. But speaking of quoting from others, this is what I loved about Alan Bennett's play. Here we have a scene with the young Posner. He often will talk with Hector. He and Hector have a really beautiful student-teacher connection. They kind of have a beautiful relationship that is more teacher-student friendly than Hector has with the other boys. So in this, he's reciting Drummer Hodge by Thomas Hardy. I wondered, sir, if this portion of that unknown plain will Hodge forever be, is like Rupert Brooke, sir. There's some corner of a foreign field, in that rich earth a richer dust concealed. It's sort of like, think about the archaeologists who discovered King Tut's tomb, and you have archaeologists today that are constantly digging and making new discoveries that Earth has covered over for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And what does the rich earth conceal that we don't know about? There's something about our history that is so deeply hidden from us that I believe that we are meant to find. We are meant to find and to discover the real truth about what it means to be human, what it means to be human, and continue to learn from our histories and to apply what we learned to now. The more I feel like it goes on a deeper level, like there's so much that is buried within us that we have to dig a little deeper inside of ourselves to bring about what that treasure is. Hector then replies, "So thrown into a common grave though he may be, he is still Hodge, the drummer. Lost boy though he is on the far side of the world, he still has a name." That made me think of the Battle of Gettysburg. That entire plain, if you were to go to Gettysburg today, it's all green. But when you look at the black and white photographs of the Gettysburg battle scenes, the aftermath, most of those soldiers were buried where they fell. If their families didn't know where they were, if they didn't know where to claim them, they were buried right there on the battlefield. And for some of them, there were no graves, there were no markers. Hector goes on to mention the compound adjectives, such as uncoffined is a typical hardy usage. A compound adjective formed by putting un in front of the noun, or verb, of course. Unkissed, unrejoicing, unconfessed, unembraced. So Thomas Hardy was an English poet and novelist. He was known as a Victorian realist. In other words, he described more of the Victorian life as it really was. We all think of this, the Victorian era, the time of Queen Victoria. But if you look at the people of the street, the average everyday person, yes, it was Victorian, but what made it Victorian? It was all, most of it was all based on what Queen Victoria did. When Prince Albert died, she was in mourning. She wore black, and that became a Victorian thing. But when you look at the lifestyle of everyday citizens, those from the high class, middle class, low class, to those in complete poverty, destitute, Victorian realists showed the reality. There was no holding back. They wanted to be as historically accurate as possible in describing the bleak and the dark ways of life. There was some type of romanticism involved, but not by much. I have yet to read Anthony Trollope. Drummer Hodge, according to Lintott, Drummer Hodge was originally published as The Dead Drummer from his poetry collection of Poems of the Past and Present. Drummer Hodge is an elegy, that's what it's called, an elegy to the average soldier, to how a soldier was treated, how they were trained, and how if they died, this is how it was. It basically represents the cruelty of war, the reality of war, the bleak, unceremonious final farewell. He is buried in, he's uncoffined. That's what it means. He is not buried in a coffin at all. He is just, they dig a shallow grave and they throw his body into the pit, which is why Hector says, "So thrown into a common grave though he may be, he is still Hodge the drummer. He still has a name." Can you imagine the names of the countless thousands of soldiers of the Gettysburg battle, of even the American Revolutionary War, the soldiers of Europe who died in World War I and II, and countless more. This, I think, was the best moment of this particular scene, in which Hector and Posner are inside the classroom, and he tells Posner this is the real reason why reading is so, it's not just so important, but it transcends beyond the page. The best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things which you had thought special and particular to you. And now here it is, set down by someone else. The person you have never met, someone even who is long dead. And it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. Posner definitely takes that to heart. And so do all readers. That's why when it comes to reading, especially if it's a library book or even if it's my own, I can't take all my books with me. But that's why I have a number of journals where I have written down quotes, one-liners, entire chapters even, because there was something that was so beautiful or so unique about this quote, that chapter, or that one line that stayed true. That's why I write them down, because I never want to forget them. And it's kind of like when it comes to the story, I'm just going to go off tangent here just for a moment. Fahrenheit 451, towards the end, when Guy Montag comes upon the outsiders, these are people whom he says he is directed to say, there is Moby Dick. What do you mean there is Moby Dick? This person, so-and-so, is Moby Dick, because they have the majority of the story memorized. Remember in Fahrenheit 451, Chief Beatty and the firemen, their job was to burn books, not save them at all. Books to them were dangerous. That was Ray Bradbury's commentary on not only the book burnings of Germany in the 1930s, but also to comment on the fact that the Russians actually executed their own authors. They actually burned their authors. Going back. So most of that was from Act 1. At this point, Irwin has been given his hours with the boys to teach them about history. And the problem that he's seeing from the boys is he says their essays are so dull. They're all saying the same thing. Why can't you say something different? Say something in the opposition's defense. So, but at this point is when Mrs. Lintott is told by the headmaster that he's heard something from, circulating, that the boys have been groped by Hector. But the headmaster at that point says, it is time he goes. He has passed his prime, and the way that he's handling things is unethical. It is downright disgraceful, and we do not want that to be part of our reputation at the school. So it's time he goes. All the characters have been given their own monologues. They've been kind of given their very own soliloquies in a way that the audience knows what they're thinking, and they're actually talking to the audience and saying, this is who I am, this is what's really going on, here's who I think of this and who else, all except for Mrs. Lintott. And finally, in Act 2, when Mrs. Lintott is alone in the class, there's this moment on stage where she walks out from behind the desk and she approaches the audience. And this is what she says. I have not hitherto been allotted an inner voice. At that moment, the audience went nuts. They're like, finally, the woman has a voice. Oh, yes. Hitherto. In other words, I have not been given a voice to speak. Until now. My role, a patient and not amused sufferance of the predilections and preoccupations of men. They kick their particular stone along the street, and I watch. I am, it is true, confided in all parties, my agenda some sort of safeguard against the onward transmission of information. Though that I should be assumed to be so discreet is in itself condescending. I am what men would call a safe pair of hands. Let's break that quote down, shall we? She says, my role, a patient and not unamused sufferance. Talk about the suffragettes, the women who suffered to get the vote. But even as teachers, women were still restricted. There was a time when if you decided to, as a woman, when you were finally given the chance to become a teacher, there were rules that you could not break. And one of them was, you could not marry. You could not start a family. The moment that happened, you were done. Because before women were allowed to become teachers, they were governesses. They were the ones who taught the children in the households of those that could afford them. And the governesses led very, very lonely lives. I guess those believed that if women were allowed to let loose, if they were allowed to fall in love, if they were allowed to start a family, that they would lose the trueness of what a teacher is. That's not so much the case. She is patient, and she's unamused at the fact that people would see her as one who suffers under the preoccupations and predilections of those who taught before her, were mainly all men. She's basically a patient observer as men continue to go about their thing, but as a teacher, she knows better. Female teachers, like myself, seem to have more of a motherly nature as to what Dorothy Lintott is basically. She's kind of giving that hint that because she's a woman, people will turn to her for like a motherly, nurtured way, and that's how she is perceived. That's how women have been. They are basically the caretakers. The fact that it's been like that for a very long time, she says that is so degrading. At that point, Miss Lintott turns around and Irwin comes in. She says, "Our headmaster is a twat." There was a consoling myth that not very bright children could always become artists. Drones of the half-educated left with the notion that art or some form of self-realization was a viable option. It's by the same well-meaning token that it's assumed still that every third person in prison is a potential Van Gogh. What she's saying here is that the headmaster is so strict in knowing who the students are at his school. He's even saying that there are students that part of this group of 8. One of these students is named Hodge, and he's a sportsman. He's by far one of the best physically abled students whose great prowess is at sports. But he doesn't find him as academically inclined. So Mrs. Lintott is commentating on that. So she says, there was a consoling myth that those who were half-educated or those that were not academically inclined could become artists as a viable option. And then she even compares them to a potential Van Gogh. So Van Gogh was a Dutch artist. He was not academically inclined. He was supposed to be a minister. He was supposed to go into preaching, but it never really stayed with him. And he needed to find another outlet. He was not that academic. He was not very bright, and he suffered because of personal issues, his own demons. So he turned to art, and only after he died did he become well known. So it's sort of like, well, if you're not going to be educated, if you're not going to take academics seriously, you could always turn to art. Even those that at the time that were called, dare I even go using those words because they are so derogatory, but those that were mentally institutionalized, even those that were in those mental institutions could create art. And some of the most famous artists that we know, the reason that they become famous is somehow their artwork becomes so socially acceptable. So art, in this case, was sort of a safe backup. This is a page that I had to write down. Hector knows that he's going to be let go, and he has his emotions get the better of him, and he cries in front of his students. At this point, he and Irwin are now sharing the class, and the students are trying to figure out, well, who do we follow? Do we follow you, Mr. Hector, or do we follow you, Mr. Irwin? And they're supposed to be collaborating together. And at one point, this is the biggie, the Holocaust comes up in conversation. But how can you teach the Holocaust? Well, that would do as a question, says Irwin. Can you, should you, teach the Holocaust? Hector then brings up some interesting questions. He says, well, they go on school trips nowadays, don't they? Auschwitz, Dachau. What has always concerned me is, where do they eat their sandwiches? Drink their Coke? Do they take pictures of each other there? Are they smiling? Do they hold hands? Nothing is appropriate. Just as questions on an examination paper are inappropriate. How can the boys scribble down an answer, however well put, that doesn't demean the suffering involved? And putting it well demeans as much as putting it badly. And he says, what if you were to write this, that this was so far beyond one's experience, silence is the only proper response? I'm going to go include an anecdote. This may be a little bit longer than usual. As a Jew, I'm still learning. There's still histories of the Holocaust that I don't even know about. And even as a college student, I was completely in shock by the stories I heard and the history. In the 20th century, the Holocaust was the greatest genocide that ever took place. Considering it basically consumed 6 million Jews plus 5 million approximate more that were non-Jews on top of that. It boggles the mind as to how anything of that nature could get out of hand. So going back to the Holocaust, as a child, there was this documentary that my parents watched called Shoah. I did not like what I was seeing, and I usually would never watch what I like to call the old movies, the classic movies, but this was in color, and it made it even scarier. We went to Washington, D.C., and we went to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Because he was so little and we were a family, they would not allow us to go into the main section of the museum. We were only allowed to go into the Children's Museum. But what I do recall, and this was just a few years before Schindler's List had hit theaters, but I remembered in the museum, there was this one corner, there was this display case that had Schindler's original, this little notebook of the list of people that he saved from being murdered in the camps. In 8th grade, that's when we took a school trip to the Museum of Tolerance in Culver City. And I remember when we got there, the moment you walked into this interactive museum-like maze, and each segment of this museum, when you walked through, it was like you were walking through the camp. And I remember at one point in this museum, there was this replica of a gas chamber that was meant to resemble showers. I sat down on one of these benches. There were, I think, 6 or 8 screens throughout this entire enclosed room. And the stories that we saw, the stories we heard, the visuals that were up on those screens. And I'm not sure if it was a photograph. I don't recall if it was a visual drawing that the German soldier drew down from this person. But this profile of this rabbi, what he said to the soldier before he went in, was prophetic. The image of that rabbi, it was like you could see his face, you could see the beard, but it was almost as if he had no pupils, like his eyes were white. It was the scariest thing. It was just a really unforgettable experience. 1999. Anti-Semitism became a thing after my preschool was shot up by Beaufort Furrow. Luckily, thank goodness, no one at the school was killed, but five people, one adult, 1 teen, and 3 of the preschool children were shot at. We found out that a mail carrier who was of mixed race was shot and killed by Furrow. He was caught. I honestly don't know what happened to him, and to be honest, I really don't care. But what I absolutely detest is that the name of the school was taken away just a few months later because of that incident. That's telling me that these neo-Nazis won. That to me is a huge insult to injury. How dare you take away the name of the school, and now I'm not even sure what the school is called. The very mission of the preschool disappeared when Buford Furrow shot it up. And now, because of, what's been going on with October 7th, people are saying, not again. This will not happen again. And this is why Holocaust survivors today are striving to make sure that their stories are not just told over and over and over. They want to make sure that this does not happen again. This was the worst that humanity can possibly sink as low as it can go. And lower. It comes to that question. How can someone teach the Holocaust? And when you go to these places, what do you guys do? I would actually like to hear from most of you, if you have traveled to these places where the camps were, if you are Holocaust survivors, can you take pictures of where you were before, and can you take pictures there now? What are the thoughts that run through your mind when you go to these places? Or students, what goes on in your mind when you hear directly from a Holocaust survivor who survived to tell the tale? Do you remain silent because it's so unspeakable? It's so difficult to comprehend as to what happened here that you must remain silent? Can you speak of it? Can you shout? When I went into that replica of the gas chamber where we watched those screens, there was nothing but silence from everybody. This is history. Distance yourselves. Our perspective on the past alters. Looking back immediately in front of us is dead ground. We don't see it, and because we don't see it, this means that there is no period so remote as the recent past, and one of the historian's jobs is to anticipate what our perspective of that time period will be, even on the Holocaust. So he's saying, as historians, when we tend to look back, even I want to say this for educators as well, and as students, when you are taught history, what goes on in your mind when you're taught about this era? The Ming Dynasty, the Floating World, the Heian era, the Victorian era, the Edwardian era, the American Revolutionary era. What goes on in your head? Do you see that dead ground? Do you see that if you were to suddenly look back and you see that maybe there's a portal that allows you to look back and imagine what this history looked like? What if there were no pictures of this history? Before the photograph came into existence, people had to rely on sketches, on paintings, written testimonials, letters. I mean, all of that is to anticipate what we can't see and to reflect on that. But another thing that he's also saying to these students is, in your essays, you need to say something different. You need to say something in defense of the opposition. Sometimes you'll be reading an article or a text or a book that is so biased. And until I actually started teaching my students, I still didn't quite understand, what does it mean when an author is biased? It means they're very one-sided. They're giving their opinion of it, and they're not looking to correlate between their perspective versus the other. And he says the historian's job, basically, is to tell it from all sides, to be neutral. And being an American student, I'm not taught about British history. I'm taught about American history from the American side growing up. There are so many wrongs that Americans today have not learned from history. Is that my fault that I didn't know? I think that when it comes to your interest of what you want to research, that is when it truly becomes yours. And people who have that interest will go there. Some people won't. But you know what? Be open. Be open to learn, because honestly, we are all student learners for life. Always. Going back to the play in Act 2, at this point, the students are now in interview practice mode. So they not only have to pass these examinations and send it off to the colleges that they wish to apply to, but now they have to do the next test, which is, can they pass the interview test? This is where my most favorite scene comes in. This is the reason why I watched the History Boys after Trump won the election in 2016. So each of the boys are called up one by one. They're being interviewed by the three teachers, Mrs. Lintott, Hector, and Irwin. The students aren't really responding, and the two male teachers, Irwin and Hector, are kind of giving their own suggestion. One is always a little bit more conservative. One is a little bit more liberal, saying, say something outside of that. Hector's saying, stick with what you know. And Irwin is saying, they've all heard the same thing. They're going to want to hear something different. And the students are like, well, where do we go from here? So then Hector says, Dorothy, do you have anything to add? I hesitate to mention this, lest it occasion a sophisticated groan, but it may have not crossed your minds, but one of the dons who interviews you may be a woman. I'm reluctant at this stage of the game to expose you to new ideas, but having taught you all history on a strictly non-gender-oriented basis, I just wondered if it occurs to any of you how dispiriting this can be. She's saying to the boys, I'm going to remind you right now that one of the dons, or one of the college recruiters, one of the administrators there, who's going to interview you, they're not all going to be male. There could be some female administrators in there. There could be, one of the dons could be a woman. You need to be able to speak to them as you should be able to speak to me. And that's when the boys realize, oh, we know why, because she's the only woman in this room. Lockwood then comes in and he says, the world is everything that is the case, miss. It's Wittgenstein, miss. Yes, I know it's Wittgenstein. Thank you. But then she says something about Wittgenstein. She says, the world is everything that is the case. Seems actually rather a feminine approach, don't you think? A feminine approach to things. Rueful, accepting, taking things as you find them. A real man would be trickier. The world is everything that can be made to seem the case. How about when women decided to start wearing pants? That was a change. They put on the cap of a masculine approach and say, so what? You have the right to wear pants? So do we. Maybe men will learn to be afraid of us. Maybe men will learn that we are not to be taken for granted. We have just as much balls in the game as you do. So then she lets the boys have it. She finally stands before her students and she says, can you for a moment imagine how depressing it is for me to teach 5 centuries of masculine ineptitude? How dispiriting, she says, that as a history teacher, I have to teach you 5 centuries of masculine stupidity, the bad leadership of men. She's been, as a teacher, this is what she's been taught. This is part of her credentials. This is part of her background education as a history teacher. What if women were to take those books, throw them away, and look at the books of other women and say, this is the history that we should be teaching? History is not such a frolic for women as it is for men. Why should it be? They never bother even getting around to the conference table. In 1919, for instance, they just arranged the flowers, then gracefully retired. Basically, what she's saying is that women came in to pretty up the place for the clientele, or for students, or for meetings. Women were meant to be, as she called herself earlier, a safe pair of hands. They made everything look pretty. They made everything look comforting. They made it look like you can come in and there was going to be no problem. But women, we were not meant to be looked at to have a mind. We were not looked at to have a voice in the matter. We just came in and did what we were told to do. Submissive, rueful, accepting, taking things as they are. At this point, Mrs. Lintott gives her boys two definitions of history. One that is somewhat neutral but a feminine approach, and the other definition is her own commentary. Take a listen. History is a commentary of the various and continuing incapabilities of men. What is history? History is women following behind with a bucket. I'm not sure if any of you recall when you were in school, and I'm honestly not sure when this started happening, but how many of you remember as students that your teachers on like the first day of class, your teachers would go around and give you a little index card. And they would have you write down the subject, the general or the elective of the class. And they would ask you to define it in your own words. How many of you were actually given a card like that? How many of you were asked that question by the teachers? How do you define history? How many of you as students turned around and asked your teachers to define it? Did any of you have the guts to ask them the same thing? Why not ask them? I'm pretty sure that teachers will have their own definition. How do you define English? How do you define math? How do you define history? How do you define science? How do you define theater? How do you define art? How do you define music? How do you define philosophy? How do you define sociology? Every teacher should, and if you don't, you should have your own definition of the subject you teach. Because the thing is, if a student asks you that question and you can't answer, they're going to look to you and say, why should we trust you? You don't even know you don't even know what it is that you're teaching us. Maybe that's how they'll see you. But that's another thing that I want to bring up is that at the beginning of the play, at the beginning of the film of the History Boys, Hector says to his boys, this is before Irwin comes in, he says, the headmaster has given us general studies. And Hector reminds him, he says, boys, general studies is a waste of time. It is not general. It is specific. Maybe if students were given that notion that the general studies, such as the main four that you're supposed to have, English, history, science, and math. The others are electives. Electives in this case are optional. They are your choices as students. Or it's up to the school to say whether or not they will have an art class or a music class or a theater class. But they are electives because they're not considered hardcore general studies. And that to me is a big no-no. Yes, those classes should be specific. Such as when it comes to the classes I taught high school English 11 and 12. English 11 in most schools is you're studying American literature. In 12th grade, you begin to learn a little bit more about world literature, including Shakespeare. Usually around the time as seniors, your job is to start thinking about your future. So what I did was that I included college studies. I also included Richard Bowles' What Color is Your Parachute? Because some students don't really know what their passion is. They don't know. They're kind of unsure. And some students, I was surprised to learn, they really don't care. Their families have a business, and they're they're saying that the moment that they graduate, they're going to go into that business. So that tells me that sometimes students just they're not that ambitious. is it really up to the teachers to push them where they really don't want to? Is that really up to us? We can let the students know you could have more ambitions than you ever thought of. But I am here to give you that option. And sometimes there was a story I remember reading years ago on how a teacher did something for his student, and she turned right around and she says, "How dare you send my essay to that college? That is not where I wanted to go. I am not good enough to be there." And he says to her, "Look at your grades. Look at your responses. Look at how they reached back to me to say, can you send us some more of her work?" And she didn't know that she could do more than what she originally thought, because someone else saw an unforeseen future that only she could make if she took that step. So she decided to take it. Years later, she says, "Thank you for pushing me. Thank you for seeing a future that I didn't see." So going back to Lintott's quote here, "History is a commentary on the various and continuing incapabilities of men." I do not want to see another 4 years with Trump. He didn't do bad, but he was the first president that I will forever remember as the tweeting president. We heard more of his rants on Twitter than anything else. And in 2017, when I finally was able to take the classes to clear my credential, I really do not want any professors to have this as part of your curriculum. One of the professors I had included that we had to create a Twitter account for a few of these assignments and to comment. I let her know, I said, because of our current PR, I do not like this person, and whatever he does, I was railing against it. I told her, I said, I am not comfortable of creating an account. Why are you telling us that we have to do this? And I know that she wrote me back something, but I was like, I'm sorry, I am not comfortable. So now that social media, which really screwed me up a lot more than I thought. But let me say this, anyone who is teaching future teachers educated curriculum, social media, creating a social account should be an option. Do not have that as a must. So when Mrs. Lintott says, "History is women following behind with a bucket," I have an anecdote. Some of my English students came to work with me after a class until they were picked up. And one of the students was the sister to one of our staff members. And we all were talking about the election and the fears and the uncertainties. And I happened to bring up the history boys. And I just happened to say that same quote. And the moment I said that, the student burst into tears. And I grabbed a Kleenex and I gave it to her. I said, "I'm sorry, did I say something wrong? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you." She says, "No, you have no idea how much I needed to hear that." That told me, as an educator, I did my job. And guess what? It was not something that was part of my curriculum. I just happened to say it. What Mrs. Lintott was referring to is that she refers to women as the history housekeepers. We're the women, we are the subjects, the subservients who are there to clean up after the great deluge that men with bad leadership constantly leave behind. I didn't get home until like 4 or 5 o'clock at night, and I had missed what had happened. I must have been alone in my room because no one was talking to me about it, and I must have been oblivious. But I did not know that Trump, who had lost the election, had tried to overturn it in such a way. I saw all of those clips on how he provoked his most devoted followers to overturn the vote, that he was wronged. But it's the way that he provoked it, and look what they did. deliberately attacked the people inside the nation's Capitol building. When I saw that, everything froze, and I remembered what could have happened 20-something years before on 9/11. The people on Flight 93, I don't know. It's somewhat debatable if they knew that the plane they were on was heading towards the nation's Capitol building. People in the nation's capital were spared that day because of the average everyday citizens that were just on a plane to get from point A to point B, interrupted by hijackers, the pilots killed, and they decided to let the world know what's happening. They were getting the reports from other family members that the World Trade Center, the Pentagon had been hit. They didn't know where they were going, most likely. But they were letting their loved ones know they were on a hijacked plane and they were going to try to do something before the plane hit something else. So they waited until they were over an area that had no particular districts around. There was no city life, nothing. It was all open field. No particular landmarks were present. So they decided, while the hijackers were up front, the citizens that were on Flight 93 united together as one to decide to take back the plane. And just as the people reached the cockpit, most likely they were trying to get at the controls. And that plane dove into the ground right outside of Camp David. But its target was the nation's Capitol building and the people inside. So for Trump to deliberately attack the very building that houses the House of Representatives and the Senate, American citizens attacking other American citizens, even those who are law enforcement. Many of the what's sickening is that some of these officers who survived that day of the attack, and then when Trump finally said, "Okay, guys, you've gone a little too far ahead. You need to go home. Take it home." That was no excuse. Some of the people who attacked the nation's capital were killed that day. But what about the police officers who were so critically injured that some of them died? Guess what, Trump? I am not afraid to say this. Murderer is attached to your title, not president. So I don't sympathize with anyone who votes for a man who deliberately provoked his followers to attack the very citizens that he was sworn to protect. There is no excuse. And for him to pay off others to make sure that he has immunity, absolutely not. I'd like to know where our democracy is headed. It is hard to believe that people are voting for him. I'm sorry. I am talk about up in arms. I am disgusted to take the Constitution and not protect it, but to take the very ideology of what it means to be an American citizen and destroy it on your orders, under your control. That is treason. Trump is synonymous with treason, whereas Harris is synonymous with heroism and heroism. I want you all to think about that when it comes to this election day. The last thing in the play that I want to bring up is Hector's final line. So I'm not sure if any of you if you've seen the History Boys, Irwin had never been on the back of a motorbike. So there's that scene in the film, and you actually hear it in the play. You hear the motorcycle go off, and suddenly you hear that skid, and Hector is killed. But there's a scene in the film where Mrs. Lintott, Irwin, and the boys, they all take a little field trip to, I think it was to Canterbury, and they all take a picture together. And as Hector is going up to take his place for the photograph, he says this: "Pass the parcel. That's sometimes all you can do." take it, feel it, and pass it on. And we pass on the lessons that we've learned to the students, and we hope that they will learn from us, question us, interpret, and then apply it. Apply what appeals to them. Apply what makes sense from us to them. So as to take what we learned and pass the parcel, to pass on the lessons. And hopefully to pass on our knowledge that today's decision makers, today's voters, look at history, recall what happened on 9/11, because the people on board Flight 93 must be remembered for their actions. For them to spare the lives of the people who were there at the nation's capital that day on 9/11, to me, it would be a slap in the face if we allowed this criminal. He's as bad as Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden wasn't there. He was not one of the hijackers, but guess what? He was the mastermind. He was the plot master. We didn't think that we would ever get him. And then when Obama took office, it was 10 years later when he addressed the nation, and he said simply, America, we got him. So Americans, I am pleading to all of you, whether or not you have voted, I really want you to think about, because 9/11 is part of our history, and God forbid we don't want that to happen again. This is equal as Timothy McVeigh when he blew up the Oklahoma Federal Building. An American doing that to the average everyday citizen. What right did you have to do that? You really want to make America great again? Make America great by looking at the true leaders who did not attack their citizens. Look at the leaders who are going to be there for their citizens. And I'm going to leave you all with one final quote. In governing, don't try to control. My favorite opera diva, Joyce DiDonato, whose video I shared, she was saying, make sure to put your vote in for the electoral candidates for the presidency, because leaving it blank will have others decide for you. Your choice could be going if he's elected. You will not have a voice to protest. You will have no right to say so. This is why there are 3 branches of power. Not 1, 3. They're supposed to be allies in our government. If one gives total control to the president, that is like giving complete control to a king. America is not a monarchy. It never has been. Women have been known to lead. And I think it's high time that America put a woman in the White House. That a woman would be a commander-in-chief, that a woman could possibly lead us in a good direction. Learn, read, question, interpret, and apply when you vote. Because voting is our choice. And when you get a chance, read the history, boys. Here's to all my book dragons. Keep on reading, and let us keep going.